Let's be honest. The 2024-25 Portland Trailblazers weren't a great basketball team. They finished with a 36-46 record, they finished 12th in the Western Conference, and they missed the play-in tournament entirely. For most of the league, and honestly most fans, they were an afterthought. Just another rebuilding team stockpiling assets and hoping its young talent would pan out. But within that losing season, something pretty amazing started to happen after the All-Star break. Especially amazing for a team in Portland. They started to defend. I know, it sounds absurd, but for the first time in what feels like a long time, Portland actually forged the defensive identity. They finished the season at 16th in defensive rating, a staggering jump for a franchise that has regularly been a defensive disaster for the better part of a decade, and certainly has been the last 5 years. This leap was made possible by their elite defense after the All-Star break, a part of the season where they were 4th in defensive rating. And it wasn't a fluke, it wasn't benefited from a weak schedule. It was the result of a deliberate shift and changing culture that started right at the top, and it's been growing as a result of their recent coaching, their recent roster moves, and their player development. But what if this was just the beginning? What if this leap from defensive irrelevance to elite defensive flashes was simply step one in a plan to build a defensive juggernaut? The league might be sleeping on Portland now, but the foundation has been laid. This is how the Blazers have started to build their new identity and what comes next in terms of their elite defensive future. To really understand why this defensive turnaround is such a big deal, you have to understand how deep the problems ran. For years, the franchise operated on a unspoken but evident result to everyone. It was all about offense first, all about offense second, and hopefully we can figure out the defense, but it probably wasn't going to happen. The Dame and CJ era, for all of its offensive fireworks and legendary clutch moments, was certainly defined by one glaring weakness. They just couldn't defend. They tried to supplement their defense on the wings, and at times they were okay with one season of a top 10 defense that was very much led by Al-Farouq Aminu and Mo Harkless and the pre-injury decent defense of Jusuf Nurkic. But their offensive-minded duo being anchored by Jusuf Nurkic, especially post-injury, was never going to be a good defensive unit. Since 2018, the Blazers have failed to finish in the top half of the league in defensive rating, with 4 of those years resulting in bottom 5 finishes. The problem was simply systemic with their roster. Their identity and their duo was built around 2 undersized guards who, despite their offensive genius, were relentlessly targeted on defense. They would have needed elite personnel behind them to make it a good defense, and they just didn't have that. When the team finally moved on from the Dame and CJ era, the rebuild was just as messy on the defensive end as it had ever been. It's been a chaotic mess of mismatched parts and no clear direction. They've been near the bottom of the league in defense, and it felt like they were stuck there for the long term and continuing their trend of poor defense. This history is what makes the 2024-25 season, especially the back end of it, so compelling. The jump towards a league average defense with nearly half of the year being inside the top 5 wasn't just a move up the rankings. It was a complete shift from who they'd been for nearly a decade. It was a signal that the franchise was no longer content with simply trying to outscore its opponents and finally focusing on building a defense. So what changed? How does a team that's been defensively inept and unable to form a defensive identity for a decade suddenly find its footing? Well, the answer starts with head coach Chauncey Billups. When Billups was hired in 2021, he was brought in to instill a new level of toughness and defensive discipline, the very things that defined his own Hall of Fame career. For his first couple of years in Portland, that vision looked murky. The roster wasn't built for that vision, and the old habits were hard to break. Talks of Chauncey not being the right hire began, but ultimately those talks have been deemed very foolish. In 2024-25, with a roster fully bought into the rebuild, filled with young coachable talent, Billups' philosophy finally started to click. It all started with 2 things. First, accountability. Billups demanded a level of defensive effort that the organization hadn't seen in years. Talented scorers like Shaedon Sharpe were no longer just given a pass. You had to defend to continue to have significant minutes. This began to create the culture. Secondly, Billups started to develop the game plan that could lead to their defensive success thanks to their new elite young talent on that end. They weren't just sitting back anymore, they were making sure the opposition felt their pressure, that they were forcing turnovers and creating chaos. This has finally been able to be created thanks to the deliberate roster moves they've made over the last couple of seasons to ensure defensive talent is on the roster. The team's length on the wings with players like Toumani Camara and Denny Avdia allowed them to be way more disruptive. Camara, especially in just his second season, became the heart of this new identity, leading the team with 1.5 steals per game and showing off that gritty, high-effort style that Billups loves. And what wasn't a perfect defense by any means, it was still young and made young team mistakes. Sure, communication would break down at times and rotations would be missed, but for the first time, there was a clear identity. They were a team that was going to fight you on every possession. They were going to be physical, they were going to be disruptive, and they would make you work for every single bucket. Now, outside of the roster moves and outside of Chauncey Billups, this defense is built on a foundation. Now, it's a very young foundation, but it is very solid and has a ton of room for growth, and that is in Donovan Clingan and Toumani Camara. Let's start with Donovan Clingan. When Portland drafted him 7th overall, they weren't just drafting a big. They were drafting the core to an elite defensive system. At 7'2" with his massive wingspan, Clingan is an amazing rim protector. Now, his stats don't tell the whole story. His real impact just isn't in shot blocking like a lot of young bigs are who are very athletic and like to live at making crazy blocks at the rim. But Clingan is a very intelligent rim protector. The shots he changes are significant, and he prevents plenty of drives every single game by his presence and his positioning. His brain and his discipline as a young big are absurd, and what makes him such a promising young rim protector. His presence in the paint lets Portland's perimeter defenders be more aggressive, hound ball handlers, be aggressive over screens, and know that they can try to cause aggressive havoc that might get them burned because they know Clingan is behind them. Clingan really emerged and increased his production with his increased minutes after the All-Star break, as we saw him average 9.6 rebounds and 1.8 blocks a night. While Clingan holds down the paint, Toumani Camara is the engine of the defense on the perimeter. Camara may not have been a draft selection of the Blazers, but clearly they saw good things in him very early as they acquired him before he played a single game in the NBA. Ultimately, in a trade that saw Portland also acquire DeAndre Ayton, Camara has been and will continue to be the best player that they received in that September 2023 trade. Camara is the ultimate defensive utility knife. In his second season, he established himself as one of the most versatile and disruptive wing defenders in the game, and proved he's going to be an all-defensive caliber wing for a long time. He is the guy that Billups trusts to guard the other team's best player, no matter the position. Well, other than, of course, if he's a center. He is the point of attack guy that every coach dreams of, but is also an elite off-ball disruptor and playmaker. One night, he's chasing a quick point guard, and the next, he's battling a bruising forward in the post. He's a blend of size, speed, and super high basketball sense that lets him be a defensive force on every possession. He's the modern defensive specialist. He's not just a small guard who's good on point guards. He's not just a big man who's going to roam the rim like Rudy Gobert. He can roam around and help on multiple positions. He can switch everything, and he is going to be a pest at the point of attack. Together, Clingan and Camara are the two pillars of a modern NBA defense. You have the dominant anchor protecting the rim and a versatile wing who can switch everything and blow up every team's favorite play. This is the foundation, and this is how you build your identity. It's young, it's athletic, and it's built on toughness, and most importantly, intelligence. This duo is why Portland's defensive success and identity is sustainable, and why their finish in the middle of the pack is their floor, not their ceiling. Now, as much as the Blazers showed great flashes after the All-Star break, the guard point of attack defense has still been lacking at times for Portland. Now, of course, Camara picks up the slack for this at times, but ultimately Scoot Henderson and Shaedon Sharpe are going to have to fill some of this role by virtue of being the two starting guards. Now, of course, Damian Lillard is back, at least going into a year from now, and he's not exactly going to help their point of attack defense on the guard front either. Now, certainly as great athletes, there's certainly room for improvement defensively, especially in the case of Scoot Henderson and Shaden Sharp. But in the short term, the Blazers acquired the perfect mentor and player for the point of attack guard defense role, Jrue Holiday. He is going to fit their system perfectly and will be an amazing mentor to further instill their defensive identity. Last year, you get the emergence of Kamara and Klingon as true all-defensive level of talents defensively, and you have a top 5 defensive rating post-All-Star break. You want to lean in to that success you had defensively and near 500 basketball post-All-Star break? You bring in Jrue Holiday. Now, certainly Holiday isn't going to be a long-term option, but it's going to be very impactful in the short term, and I think it could absolutely secure and lock in this identity as part of the Blazers' success going forward, and will immediately allow them to be at least a relatively competitive roster, even in this very competitive Western Conference. The Trailblazers are building something special here, and they're doing it from the defensive end up. In the 2024-25 season, they went from a defensive afterthought to a team with a clear, promising identity. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of a cultural shift from the front office and Chauncey Billups downwards. They have found the pillars in their paint patrolling dominance and in their relentless versatility with Klingon and Kamara. They have set a new standard of effort for their talented young guards, and they are no longer willing to be an easy out and just fold over defensively. They have grit, they have length, they have a plan, and they have an identity. The Blazers are no longer just a rebuilding team hoping for lottery luck. They are deliberately constructing a defensive monster going forward. And with the right moves and continued growth, they are closer than I think most people believe to unleashing a defense that doesn't just win a few extra games, but can get them into the postseason. They're probably a few years away from being a solidified playoff team that is a lock in the Western Conference, and they probably have some more development on the offensive end at this point. But the defense for a young team is always the hardest part to figure out, and they've figured it out. Don't be shocked to see this team battle for the play-in tournament this season, be a top 10 defense, and continue developing into what I believe to be one of the better young cores in the Western Conference going forward.